later it would be said by Naboo and Gungan alike that they couldn't recall a colder winter than the one that followed Higo Damask's autumnal visit to the capital of Theed. There's no language of that kind. There's no prosaic sort of almost poetry to it. It's very, very just streamlined.
It's not connected to the story of the book. Like that should be the driving through line throughout this entire book, as the rise of Darth Vader. The struggles of Vader, the struggles of him under Palpatine, and then everything else in terms of the plot and character should be secondary. But it's the reverse. It feels like everything else with the Jedi and the crew and all that, and even Bail Organa, for Christ's sake, all great stuff. Feels like that's the real story being told.
This book is it's entertaining. It has good characters, good character moments, and very, very competent writing. It's just when you set it against what came before and what it's supposed to represent for the Vader character and the wider Star Wars universe, a lot of it, at best, it just rings the same as a lot of other things you've maybe experienced from other works, and at worst, it doesn't ring at all.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the internet, and welcome back to Fanalysis Star Wars. I'm Callan, this is Matt.
Hey everybody, welcome.
And this is Evan.
Hello everyone.
Today we are finally, after many a long year, talking about Dark Lord Rise of Darth Vader. Who wants to start us off with general thoughts on this one, guys?
I told you we'd get to it eventually. Just took us... See, we do fulfill
I think
our
it
promises.
might have been about 8 years, so sorry about that.
Yeah.
We'll get there when we get there.
Exactly. But this is the conclusion to the Dark Lord trilogy, written by James Luceno, interestingly enough. And I think our opinions on this are pretty much in line in the sense of I sort of view this book kind of like DLC, if that makes sense, to Revenge of the Sith, because it essentially it's a direct follow-up to the events of the movie and is kind of meant to sort of bridge the gap in characterization between, the two trilogies, as well as sort of set the groundwork for a lot of other future stories, which I'm not necessarily saying that as an insult, but I think it's a fairly simplistic story compared to a lot of the previous entries in this series, which... Granted, the previous entries were Revenge of the Sith and Labyrinth of Evil, which are pretty, large stories, which, although this one, I don't know if I would necessarily consider this a small story, but it is definitely a bit more streamlined compared to the other two. What do you guys think?
Streamlined is the word. I think it's, this is a book that I found to be... by the way, I think, Callan, this was your first time reading this, right?
Yes. I'd read the ones previously, but this one I had not had eyes on before. So
and obviously, and obviously, Evan, you've read it before in the past, and so have I.
Yeah.
I was kind of surprised. Yeah, I haven't read it in years. I only remember it, and by years I mean back when it was like new, basically. I only remember reading it the one time. Labyrinth of Evil and Revenge of the Sith, I definitely went through a few times over the years. I haven't looked at either since the last time we as a group looked at those. But those were very all-encompassing sorts of stories. Very, like in the case of Revenge of the Sith, that's obviously like kind of a crescendo, very operatic, very poetic. Matthew Stover wrote that. James Luceno also wrote Labyrinth of Evil, which I find just a much more impactful and memorable book. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, but this book to me, streamlined is the perfect word, because I don't find it terribly just... I don't want to give I don't. I was going to ask this much later, but I think I should just ask it now as just kind of my question that I don't quite have an answer to. In 2025, what is the reason to recommend this book? And I ask that because it's not that it's bad. I find it personally to be more of like a good, not great book. And this is a book that we've been asked over the years a lot of times to cover, and I wonder how much of that is earnest love for the material and how much of it is rounding out the fact we had talked about the other two entries in the trilogy and then just left this hanging for so long. This is not a bad book, in my opinion, at least. I don't want to give the impression I think it's bad, but I personally, I think that there's been so many stories like it, kind of always, but especially since, it's in the aftermath of a Jedi purge. what's going on, and the fact that it does take place partially from Vader's perspective. At the time, you could say that was novel, but even then, that was pretty much every story he was in was him hunting down some Jedi. So I just, to me, going, do you remember when we looked at, what do you call it? Yoda Dark Rendezvous.
Dark Rendezvous.
Um, that felt so fresh going back to that after so many times, so many years away. It was like eye-opening to me, and so much of the actual writing quality was so strong. But one of the earliest bits in that book is the flashback with young Dooku and Yoda, and they have the analogy of like the space version of a hermit crab coming back and like feeling too large for like the old shell kind of a thing, right? I feel like I've outgrown this book or something. Like I don't know. Like I'll have more to say about that, but to me, it doesn't feel quite as interesting. And we're looking at other Lucino material, like we've been looking at Plagueis off and on in between this, and compared to his other works, I don't know how you phrased it just a few minutes ago. I won't say that this is a small story, but it feels like it doesn't play to his strengths as an author for this setting to me. He's all about the all-encompassing tapestry of things and like the wider galaxy and a plethora of characters and like very nuanced like time sort of time-spanning machinations and political connections and consequences all coming together. And this book is by design. It's not to say this is a flaw. This book just doesn't. It's the aftermath of everything, like of Order 66, of Operation Nightfall, the end of the Clone Wars, the restructuring
It's a different
of the
kind of
galaxy.
story. It's not really.
It's a different kind of story.
And I agree, it doesn't lean to his strengths. It was odd because you mentioned as we were going through it that it feels almost like parts of this are ghost written by another writer, just in terms
There's
of how
a few
steeply
parts
they
in
drop
particular,
off.
yeah.
We'll be talking about the specific moments as they come up. But there are some moments here where the usual kind of expected quality we get from Lucino, particularly in regards to character work and how well it knits together with the feel and existing knowledge of the characters. It just seems so starkly dropped off in quality compared to his usual. The majority of it's all good, and it's all fun and enjoyable.
Yeah.
But it's the less less setting narratively consequential characters that's true for. So it's almost like either he was having to write some of this by obligation, or someone else was standing in to fill in some of the details of those characters. Obviously, we have no idea if that's true. It probably isn't true. It's probably just he had a bad day in these particular moments. But yeah, it's just noticeable considering how highly we praise him usually for this kind of material. It felt lacking there for me, and we'll get into the details of why in a bit. But yeah, definitely felt that. This was my first viewing as well.
This was your first time, yeah.
Yeah. First listening, I should say, actually, because I listened to the audiobook.
First listen.
Which will...
Right, yeah.
We'll have to talk about that.
Yeah, part of the reason we're exploring this at this time is because they recently released an unabridged production of the audio drama for this, which this didn't have for the longest time. So it's pretty much fresh in the public spotlight, which is what motivated us to ultimately do it. The audio drama, it's read by Mark Thompson, who is a veteran of Star Wars audiobooks and all that. In fact, although I don't know if he did the original version, did he?
I don't think so. First of all, I just have to say, we recently did Heir to the Empire, and I sang his praises. So please understand, I usually am down with Mr. Thompson. I like Mark Thompson a lot. But back in the day, when they were doing the first iterations of a lot of these audiobooks, it tended to be that Jonathan Davis would be the narrator that worked in this era, like the Clone Wars era. And Mark Thompson did things that were sort of like the Old Republic up to about the point of like Darth Bane's spot in the timeline. I don't know when that changed. Then it kind of just became random because Jonathan Davis did the Dark Rendezvous. He also did the Darth Bane audiobooks, which I'm not personally a fan of. I also like Jonathan Davis, by the way, but I do not like his Bane voice. More on that another day.
He did Revenge of the Sith.
He did Revenge of the Sith, which is amazing. He did Yoda Dark Rendezvous, which is amazing. But I think the original would have been him of this, the abridged version.
Okay.
But the problems with this are not fully. Can we talk about? Let's just sidebar about the audiobook, because we had a discussion a few months ago, like when to talk about which book on our list, and we wanted to put this one off because, as you just said, we knew that the audiobook was coming soon. And for me, there's an episode of Frasier where like they're hoity-toity snobs in Seattle, and like that's the premise. It's one of my favorite sitcoms. I think most people probably know what Frasier is, but on the off chance you don't, and there's an episode where some colleague of theirs, some friend of a friend, died, leaving behind like an extensive wine collection, and they keep putting off opening this bottle because they want to like save it for like a special occasion, and then at the end of the episode something bad happens and they open it up as kind of a pick me up anyway, and they all have like a cheers moment, and they drink it and it's just awful. And they're like, where did this guy keep this bottle? And he kept it in like next to a water boiler or something, like some like disgusting like hot ass dark room somewhere. So it's perfect conditions to make it terrible. After all that time waiting, that was the experience. I think the audiobook is the equivalent of that for me. We were waiting for this and looking so forward to it. What's wrong with this audiobook?
It's the mixing more than anything else. I'll be honest, I got used to it. As we got through the initial battle phase of the Clone Wars intro and we moved forward into the kind of reassembling of the characters stage, I got used to the choices they made in terms of volume, in terms of intensity, in terms of the ever presentness of the ambient audio cues, etc. I got used to it and settled down a bit, but to start with, it was almost intolerable. And I don't usually have that with audiobooks. I can usually filter out the extremes of choices.
The ship firing cannons in like the background, like you couldn't even hear what was being said half the time.
Which is kind of the point, because they're trying to create that same feel as in the scene.
Each other, it was...
Yeah, but it doesn't work in the format of audiobooks to me. To me, I always prefer that slightly tuned back. Don't go for the whole can't hear them because that's what you're supposed to feel. I'd rather I need to hear the material because that's what you're here to listen to, right? It's not an audio drama, it's an audio book.
What you're talking about is more at home in like either a kind of like a radio broadcast or a radio play, or like it's what you do in a video game when you're getting a report from somebody and you're in the field or whatever and they fudge the audio on purpose as part of the experience. This is not that.
And I think that it's definitely something that some people will enjoy. It's more of a personal choice rather than an outright flaw to me. But I don't think it lends to the strength of the medium. I think it needs to be tuned down just a little bit. But I got used to it. What I didn't quite get used to is the sheer enthusiasm from the narration at certain points. Most of the time, it's bang on. I can get on board with it for this type of story that Star Wars is. But occasionally, it's like, oh, okay, that was really enthusiastic delivery on an otherwise superfluous line.
For me,
I couldn't
it was
quite get used to that throughout the entirety.
The exuberance was normally fine and normally appropriate, but every now and then it was so off for me, and it was usually. Oh, I think that he did this thing which I have never read it this way, but he did this thing where he sometimes was using Anakin's voice as opposed to the Vader voice, and as an idea, I think that's worthwhile. I that could have been done in such a way that it would have worked for me if the tone had been more of a brooding or at the very or like a sort of like a furious kind of
it comes off a little bit whiny a lot of times.
Really whiny.
Which again I think is the point, but too much to
see. This was
my taste.
See, this was a thing though that was often said about the prequels and Hayden's performance as Anakin, and your opinions on that can be your opinions on that. Whatever you thought that was, this is like that taken up to like several notches. It's shrill to me. Like it literally, there were times where I stopped listening to the book to go do something else just because and that's bad. Like if the performance is like putting me off the story actively and I need a minute to cleanse my ears with something else, I can't say I've ever had that experience with a Star Wars book before. You know what I mean? It's just that I would say I found more than just distracting, like actively like off-putting. It was so over dramatic. And this guy, like I said, I love Mark Thompson. Like his work in other books is great. So I don't know if he was directed this way or if, as you say with Lucino, everybody has a bad day sometimes. Could have been that. I don't know. But I just know I found this audiobook, I hated it.
It was never quite hatred to me. It was just a case of this is too much for me personally. I would have done a slightly like 75% of what they've gone for. I'd have stayed for that for me. What were you saying, Evan?
I was just gonna say like it almost sounds like a parody sometimes in terms of just how much energy, particularly with the Anakin voice that it's putting into it, and then you add on the very awkward sound mixing on top of that during certain scenes, and it just it comes some segments come off as like borderline like you can't even really decipher what's going on. And for the most part though, like some of the voices in and of themselves are fine enough,
Most of
but
them are
again,
fine.
it's
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the
yeah, it's
character
just
voices. I love the choices for pretty much
yeah,
all of
yeah.
them. In
It's
that,
just a
except for Vader. Vader
presentation.
isn't quite right.
Yeah, yeah. Vader's definitely the one that's the most off. But like the presentation with the on top of the weird sound mixing just makes the whole experience kind of yeah, kind of weird. So
Well, I would.
definitely if you're interested, look it up at your own discretion.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend, if you can, just reading this the old-fashioned way. I think that would be preferable, like myself. Only listen to the audiobook if you really have like, yeah, a lot of curiosity about it, despite what we said, or if, your schedule is such that you can't sit with a book like normal. But yeah, so that's pretty much that's not really to do with the actual quality of the piece.
Yeah, of course. It was to
Yeah,
do with our experience specifically. But yeah, stepping away from the audiobook side of things more, to focus on the story again. Answering your question about why read this in 2025, Matt. For me, my honest answer is only, hey, if you're in the mood for a Star Wars story, this is a pretty decent one. It's not anything great. It's not anything super consequential. It's something you can see a lot of times in a lot of different formats, as in terms of it being a Vader hunts down Jedi story. It's got a lot of the Lucino heart that he brings to any story he writes, in terms of like the random characters that he breathes life into, and some of the world texturing that he kind of spends time on. All good for that. It's certainly not his best, but it's still it's there. The only parts of it that I think that again, it's all subjective really, but leaning into the objective aspect to me, I think most people would agree it does let the side down a bit on the Palpatine and Vader scenes, which, considering this is the rise of Darth, the rise of Darth Vader, that's kind of a significant flaw in my opinion. What are your guys' thoughts on that? Like, because I think we all agreed that it wasn't the drop off we mentioned in the intro to this. It was mostly down to Palpatine and Vader, and for most of the situation, right?
Evan, you
I
go
like a
first.
lot of the ideas that they sort of present in those sequences. Again, it's just a lot of them, especially going back and looking at it now, I was actually surprised how relatively short they were. And while the actual writing quality, I would say, is still pretty much up to standard with the other entries in this trilogy, it definitely feels like there's some development missing between each segment, because each of them is meant to highlight a different aspect of Vader's development, which is fine in of themselves, because you see Vader's gradual evolution. But the way it's presented to me, it just very much felt like, oh, I'm struggling. Oh, I'm somewhat improving. Oh, I'm okay now. Does that make sense? Like, it feels like
Yeah.
there's a lot of development that happens off screen, particularly with Vader, that the actual sequences where he describes coming into his own as a Sith Lord and sort of, fully embracing the dark side more so than he was at Revenge of the Sith. Like, we're told all these things, but the actual development that we see, I almost said on screen, but on page, for me, doesn't really ring as powerful as it should. I feel like if we had maybe an extra chapter or two just dedicated to Vader's character development in that specific area of himself, I sort of kind of would have bought it a little bit more. But as it's presented, it feels kind of scatterbrained. And while the actual writing in those sequences is fine enough, and I liked sequences, for example, where he like confronts Palpatine and is like, are these the faces of victory, sort of thing like that. The writing in that is all very, very solid, but we're kind of more is implied than is what one is actually shown, and I think that's really the biggest detriment for me when it comes to those sequences specifically, even though they are in and of themselves fine enough.
Yeah, in terms of the overall kind of arc that it's taking Vader on, and the kind of journey that it's trying to demonstrate, I completely agree. I think that it fails to kind of tell that story compellingly for me. In terms of, but more than that though, in terms of like the actual writing itself, when we're rooted in the perspectives of Palpatine and Vader, or the two of them together, as is the case a few times throughout the book, to me it feels like even maybe even 30% of that is at the quality that you'd usually expect from Lucino, if that, in some of them. The rest of it just feels very. No, it's too cruel to say amateur, but compared to Lucino quality, the standard of Lucino heights, it feels amateurish to me. Like the choices that are being made in the dialogue.
I would use
really,
that word. Yeah, I would use that word. Yeah,
because for a fact that he could he could really take these and just make them absolutely incredible. But as they're presented, it's like you would expect like, again, they're not bad, but you would expect this sort of quality from,
your average
potentially
comic kind of
less.
thing, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah, it does feel like reading a comic book sometimes, and while comic books can of course be great and are by no means excluded from good writing quality, the presentation just feels very much more bare bones than it necessarily should.
Well, let me ask a question because if allowed, I could go on for too long about Palpatine scenes in this book. And I don't want to really do that. I don't like any of them to just be perfectly blunt. But before we really talk about the issues, because I think we're kind of skirting them, like with what's going on with the writing there, I would like to focus on not like a forced positive, but more just like an honest, because I don't feel particularly well disposed towards many of these scenes, if only because I don't find them so memorable. I don't think there's anything structurally wrong with every single one of them. I don't think that they're all terrible scenes. But when you think about the book as advertising itself as Dark Lord Rise of Darth Vader, and this is what you get, it very much feels kind of like an afterthought compared to everything else going on in the book. Do you have a favorite scene? I asked that when we were looking through some of the films, like Attack of the Clones, which I couldn't really come up with one. Like Revenge of the Sith, I kind of struggled to find a scene that I
Specifically with
love.
Vader and Palpatine, you mean, or overall?
Yeah, specific to them because
I can't think of one. To be honest, it
exactly,
all felt entirely. Again, I don't. When I said comic book, I didn't mean into slightly the medium itself, but specific to Star Wars average quality comic books. And I'm aware I've not read most of the good ones before jumping, Matt. but the average comic book, certainly in the last 10 years, for the Vader meets a Jedi and hunts them down kind of thing. That level of story for the most part. It feels like just going along with that. It feels to me like when he was writing this, he wrote the entire story, and then after the fact went, okay, right now, for Vader and Palpatine, how would those conversations go post Padme death, post encapsulating in the suit, all that stuff? What needs to be said to get to the end conclusion of what we see in the films here? I don't think that question was sufficiently answered for me. I think that it was very surface level, bare bones compared to Lucino's usual quality. Particularly, again, coming off the back of Plagueis, which granted was written much later. He was a much more experienced author at that stage, but it feels like such a step down. And for them particularly, I think the exception to the highest point for me, which is not that high in the Vader side, would probably be when he's referring to the suit, when he's talking about the kind of in-world restrictions of I feel this is not a breathing, this is not living. That scene was the strongest for me.
Yeah.
So that scene, can I just real quick? That scene is the only scene that I actually really remembered from this book. That I read from you, because I had kind of, we'll get into the Jedi and the other characters, but like Roan Shrine, I was like, oh yeah, he's the Jedi from Dark Lord, right? Yeah, I don't think about Roan Shrine that much. I don't think about him that much now, having just read the book. You know what I mean? It's because the thing is that you're describing also with like the Vader hunts down a Jedi. The thing is, that's like becomes such a staple of everything, whether you're talking about canon or legends or whatever. It's not just the Vader character. I mean, that's Sith from other eras. That's the Darth Krayt era. That's that's basically what Darth Malgus was, despite living during a war with many on both sides.
And you always know how it ends as well. Always.
It's such a.
And even at the time that this was released, there were a lot of comics and even a lot of other books that like touched on these sorts of themes in arguably better ways. So this is.
And I'm sorry to because I did ask what's your favorite bit of them, and you kind of reached for the Vader's musings about being trapped in the suit, and even that, it's well done, and I remembered it like 20 years later almost. I remembered it, but now looking at it, it's a long thing, right? And it does feel a bit like he's going on a bit about it, and I'm kind of like, I know I would be as miserable or more of a bitch about this in his shoes, and I still am like tired of like listening to it. I was like, okay, I don't need it. And I'll come back around to that. But very quick sidebar, and we're not going to dive off on another topic. But Callan, you and I are reading Joe Abercrombie's books, like Glocta as a character who's like a physical wreck.
He's old.
That never gets
done well.
That never gets old to me. It never gets old, and it never feel. And he is just actively bitching, but I like it because it's full of character, perspective, and voice. This is very, almost like I'm drunk in a bar someplace, and you know what I mean. And I'm just I can't move on.
Obviously, you're meaning it for humor's sake. It's not quite that bad in that particular instance, but I completely agree. After that point, once you've had that big dose, because it is a big
It
single
happens
dose.
a lot.
It keeps happening, and it's
Yeah.
Anakin. It's Anakin. You know how whiny and annoying he can come across from his perspective. You're not supposed to like him at this stage. You're not supposed to like him at his peak, really. The way he was
Yeah.
actually portrayed, even if it shouldn't have been that case.
Yeah.
He just
Yeah,
comes
but like
across as you're so weak, and Palpatine sees it as well. I wish it played with that more. It just kind of left it hanging and didn't show
So
that you're
Palpatine,
being a whiny bitch.
Evan, you cut in, and then I want to talk about Palpatine for a little bit, because I want to talk about Palpatine pretty much once if we can, because otherwise it can be a cyclical discussion. But go ahead, please.
Yeah. Yeah, no problem. I was just gonna say, you mentioned voice, and that really is the big difference, because I haven't read those books that you guys are talking about, but at the same time, when you are reading that sequence, yes, it is interesting in terms of the ideas, but he's literally just listing things. It's the lack of it's the difference between this is the way it is because, and this is the way it is. Now,
Yeah.
the difference between those things comes down to a matter of, okay, but why though? Like, why
Yeah.
should I be like, I understand what this character is saying. I understand that this character is going through these emotions and going through these this pain, but there's not enough character investment that I am able to relate to or follow along with, because it is quite literally just saying things, and we know that. I mean, say what you want about like Anakin being someone who can come off as whiny, but we do know that in other works you can make this sort of internal pain perspective, come off more character driven. In fact, that is something that the Revenge of the Sith novelization did extremely well. But going from that to this, the differences in portrayal is like so stark, even though he is, I mean, not even arguably, even though he is going through more pain than he did in that story. I'm not feeling it nearly as much as I should, and that really is the big problem. And this even goes back to what I would consider probably my favorite Vader and Palpatine scene, being when they're at the medical facility and he's trying to repair himself, and like Palpatine is on the other side of the room and he's trying to
I love that
counsel
visual, by
him.
the way, the divide. I love the visual of him kind of stepping closer to the
Yes,
glass.
that
It's
is
very cool.
that is the setting is fantastic for that sequence, but the problem is, again, it just goes back to, yes, they're having this, you're supposed to feel this tension when Vader is confronting him, and you're supposed to feel the sort of master and apprentice generational divide. I think the thing is, it's like, getting back to Yoda Dark Rendezvous, if you want an example of this sort of sequence done a lot better, in my opinion, it's the ones between Ventress and Dooku, when they're like in his castle, when they're
and even
they're
Dooku and
having
Palpatine in the secondary scenes.
yeah, exactly. But the problem is the difference between those scenes and this scenes. Even though I do consider this the best Vader Palpatine interaction in the book, again, it's just, oh, they're having this tension. Oh, they're having this questioning because. But at the same time, there's not enough character in it for me to get as invested as I should, which is kind of a problem, because the writing in itself is fine enough, but again, you're just not there long enough for it to really sink in my opinion.
And going back to an earlier point, sorry, one second, Matt. Back to an earlier point you made on that earlier in the discussion, it's not connected to the story of the book. Like that should be the driving through line throughout this entire book, as the rise of Darth Vader. The struggles of Vader, the struggles of him under Palpatine, and then everything else in terms of the plot and character should be secondary. But it's the reverse. It feels like everything else with the Jedi and the crew and all that, and even Bail Organa, for Christ's sake, all great stuff, feels like that's the real story being told, and that shouldn't be the case. Vader should have been.
It should have been its own book.
Yeah, all of this material could have been, first of all, been executed better in a vacuum, but it shouldn't have been in a vacuum. It should have been the kind of stretched out core of the whole story, and everything else we've woven in around it. And it just feels entirely secondary and separated. Separated. I'm thinking separatists.
Well,
it doesn't work for me for those reasons.
But to your point too, is like another thing that kind of bugs me is that I almost feel like they use Palpatine as like a almost like an audience insert to kind of show you how to carry Vader's development, because you have this sequence where he's thinking to himself, oh, Vader, what's holding Vader back is not the suit, it's actually his own psychology, and once he gets over that and feels the true power of the dark side, then his true Sith education can begin. And you see the result of that later in the book, but the problem is, why couldn't I have seen Vader actually come to that conclusion himself? Instead of Palpatine saying saying it or musing about it. I think that's what really
And
kind
the
of
way
bugs
he's
me.
saying it. Should I send him to Mustafar? Maybe
Exactly.
that'd help.
Okay, can I
So
yeah,
jump back in on
I,
Palpatine, Matt, there, because now we're talking
I
about
want
him.
to. I think toward the end of the discussion, I want to come back to something Evan teed up. That'll be the way I close out what I have to say about this book later on. But focusing on Palpatine specifically, I do want to say I think it is almost always a mistake to make him a perspective. Almost always, not just in this book, but like other books. There are very few times where I think that works out. There are books I really enjoy, like Darth Maul Shadowhunter, for example, where he's in there, he's sprinkled in as a perspective every now and then, and it is always weak stuff because it's just there to tell you. And next, the plot will go here because of this. And it's what you're saying is like he has to think about these things and mull them over. The audience can pick that up themselves. They don't need all that. And he comes across as sort of tinkering and a bit incompetent, like because he's not sure how to handle this situation. And it was also written at a time when I think we were kind of left grasping at straws. You watch the movie Revenge of the Sith, and even when you read the book Revenge of the Sith, which is we all love the book, but you go, is Palpatine happy with what he's bought? Is he happy with this? Like, and you can see, like, in the film when like Vader's freaking out when he's coming off the table, he's kind of got like the sinister smile. It's a great shot. It doesn't quite feel earned, and it does feel like, okay, you do know you've got like a bit of a lemon here. Like this isn't working. And here he has to contend with that. That doesn't quite fly with the everything is gone as I've foreseen, or you know what I mean. It doesn't. He can't do that, and he doesn't really even try in like his private moments. And he does. To me, the voice of Palpatine is just. It's not that it's off in terms of like the word choices, the things he chooses to talk about, the ways in which he does not kind of flex his power. Like he's not silent enough. He's not dismissive enough. He's not harsh enough. He's
talking like too much of a normal person, which you shouldn't feel for someone who's revealed as the Dark Lord of the Sith and Emperor of a new Imperium. The Empire.
There's a sense of bargaining going on that I don't think should ever really be there. Like, you know what I mean? Like you can make the argument that it works with the Vader character. That's the one person in the galaxy he should maybe be doing that with. But it's kind of there throughout. And you talked about this just in our private chat. The first conversation with them, that one is.
You guys had teed me up saying, "Oh God, I don't remember the Vader and Emperor being bad." And I thought, "Oh, I wonder what's going to be that." Read that first one, I was like, "Oh Jesus, wasn't kidding." Like, because the Jedi in particular, he references like what matters to the Jedi. Who cares about that? And then, oh yes, the Jedi. You can kill them if you meet them in your mission. Like, it's like, why is this not a higher priority for you? And if it's not, why are we not seeing more of the answer behind that question? Because that's interesting stuff. Why are you being so dismissive of these Jedi that were your main target for this entire war, as this book talks about?
It is and always has been a part of his character that he thought they were beaten so thoroughly we don't really need to worry about the stragglers. But the way that was articulated in the story, I think, was way off. He does seem to be suggesting it's a rodent problem. We don't really need to deal with that. That's his overall perspective, and that's fair. But you just won yesterday. There is going to be resistance. You should kind of be doing, and we're going to talk about like this opens with the aftermath of Order 66 and all that, to the point where the clones themselves, some of them are wrestling with the Order. So it's very, very fresh stuff. This is not the time. If we were talking about like 5 years later,
that's a whole different equation.
Right.
This is still going on. He knows hundreds must have escaped by now. This is the highest threat he's going to face for the next 50 years of his life, and he's like, everyone, who cares?
And he comes off as funny. He comes off as silly in a bad way.
I mean, the robot chicken emperor is the emperor for me anyway. But even within that ludicrous context, he doesn't sound right here. He's too incompetent.
He's certain that like dozens escape with their lives. Like he says that, and we know that he knows that, and yet like at this point, like, no, you should not be so lackadaisical about this. Especially since the book notes at several points that like the scars that he has were given to him by the Jedi. There's weird emphasis on that whenever
that was a
panel, which it's like, but it's like it's very odd for those to be like next to each other. When the book, like the prose, go out of its way to make note of the damage to his body caused by the Jedi, and then for him to immediately start talking about how much he doesn't care about the Jedi. It's like, what?
Well, it is what Kellen said. It literally is the Jedi. Who cares about the Jedi? They don't matter. Oh yes, the Jedi. We're free. Feel free to kill. Like, I mean,
it's like three sentences
pretty,
apart, as though it's a completely different conversation. It comes across as incompetence, which he should never feel.
Yeah.
If you want the Emperor to be sold, he has to be at least coldly competent and calculating. Everything else is, gravy, but that must be at the core, at least.
And
Right. This isn't the same guy from Return of the Jedi. Not yet, anyway.
Although, I mean, he could have been. You know what I mean? It's like I feel like he could have been written that way, and it would have worked for the most part. It's all just what they're talking about and what they're not talking about. Like it's very, very. Evan, you had talked about in our chat somewhere that that particular first conversation, which I maintain is just bad. You had said that some of that was like lifted from a comic, or you weren't sure which came first.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know which came first, but I do remember that I want to say it was either one of the last of the Republic comics or one of the first.
The one where he goes to Kessel to fight the group of Jedi.
No. This was unrelated, but that sequence where he's talking to Sidious and he mentions clones that refuse to execute Order 66. I'm fairly certain that a version of that is from a comic book, but I do not know which came first. I do know the dialogue is a little different, but yeah, so I'm not so certain what that connects to.
Okay.
I know that, obviously the events that take place in this, well, I mean, some comics reference it, but there's not a comic book adaptation of this, so I honestly don't know. My guess is they were probably released close to the same time, and it was just meant to be some sort of tie-in, but don't quote me on that exactly.
And if that was the case, Lucino, don't homage this one. I know you love to do that, and I love you to connect it and replicate dialogue from other mediums and scenes and formats, but just don't on this one. It was really bad.
We could switch topics in a second, but there were times where it just felt. I mean, earlier you used the word amateurish, and I maintain that that's a fair word with some of these scenes in particular, because there's a quality. I mean, technically, I guess the EU is fan fiction. I guess you could say that. If it's paid, officially licensed or was, fan fiction,
franchised fan fiction,
franchised fan fiction. But
very expensive fan fiction.
I tend to have kind of a scathing view of most, by a wide margin, a very high percentage of fan fiction that I've read over the years. I think some of it leans into that sort of. There was a bit where there was a bit where Vader had access to purported holocrons from the Darth Bane era, and Sidious is thinking to himself, I don't quite know what's in there, but I don't need to imagine I had access to real, true Sith holocrons when I was an apprentice. Why even have this thought? That is
it doesn't even go anywhere. It's just
I mean, it's
also we get a lot of references to Plagueis.
But we know, and we'll get into that in a second. But we know you know this. You're the Dark Lord of the Sith. Who are you bragging to? You know what I mean? It's not. It's just silly. You know what I mean? That's the word. And I don't want to be thinking silly all the time when it comes to Palpatine. I know for all that you're saying that your head canon, Palpatine is basically the robot chicken, and that's largely fair. I draw the line at scenes like this that are just feel haphazard and silly. I draw the line at seeing up his skirt when Yoda throws him over his desk. There are certain things that I think are mistakes.
He needs if you want to be taking the element of fear and competence, the edge of dread.
Yeah.
Yes.
The problem, Palpatine, he shouldn't feel like he knows that there's a camera behind him. And we're reading it. That's the problem. It takes you completely out of the setting.
Very much so.
Way of putting it,
and also his use of the language as an author is usually so much more advanced, Lucino. I just feel like these moments of private musing about what I'm seeing, or what is Lord Vader going to be, or what do I need to do as a master, or how am I going to get my iron grip ensured over the rest of the galaxy? This is a fresh forged thing. It never feels. I know he could do better because he has done better in I think every book I've ever read from him. It feels very off-brand for him in some way. His use of I can't even really remember there aren't any standout phrases or descriptions or even like real lines of dialogue for the most part. There was a bit where Vader was giving chase to the Jedi, and it talked about him getting in his fighter and taking off from the planet and escaping from gravity's reign, and that kind of stuck out to me. It's like, oh, that's a Lucino line. It was like, why am I just now thinking that after like midway through the book, or like in the first third, because when you think about like particularly how he's using language in Darth Plagueis, he's dropping, pearls like everywhere, like just like very very good uses of the language. I can remember when when Plagueis first goes to Naboo. It talks about how like later it would be said by Naboo and Gungan alike that they couldn't recall a colder winter than the one that followed Higo Damask's autumnal visit to the capital of Theed. There's no language of that kind. There's no prosaic sort of almost poetry to it. It's very very just streamlined and simple, which is okay. Particularly when you're dealing with characters that are have like kind of a hard scrabble existence, as the Jedi do in the aftermath of Order 66, or with clone troopers who are trained military professionals. It's a little different when you're dealing with the Dark Lord of the Sith and his newborn apprentice, which
is the central story of the book. That's the point of it.
Yeah,
right.
And you had talked about off camera, Callan. You had made this point, and I think it's worth highlighting. Palpatine's advice isn't any more helpful than Yoda's was when he told him to get over the fact
he literally sits down at one point and says, "Oh, I will teach you to have, seek to be detached, and your duties and your Sifdom will take care of the rest." It basically just gives the exact same speech that Yoda does, except the dark side instead of the light. It does nothing for him, and he should be aware of that. Part of his manipulation and part of his competence is in knowing that.
And the Revenge of the Sith,
he literally tries to give him like a Sith version of the we are not this crude matter sort of.
That was terrible. Because he said we are not this crude stuff. Like and that is what he said. That was terrible. And that is what I mean when I said it has that fan fictionitis kind of a quality. I mean, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter, is a beautiful line, and you know what I mean, and specific. And everyone knows that's Yoda talking to Luke, right? Yeah, sure. And you can tie it back to real philosophy or your religion or your perspective in life, what have you. You understand that. We are not this crude stuff. Is a cheap,
in reference to just the scars as well.
It's very very. That was terrible. I forgot about it. Yeah, thank you.
It really doesn't help that he tries to tee that up as like the true meaning behind that, because when he talks to Vader about that, have you ever heard that? And Vader even says, yes, I've heard that before, too often. And he's like, well, from me you'll learn the truth of it. It's like, okay, but your version is even worse. So
he should know. He should know how to bait and switch with Anakin. He should know how to tempt him. The whole point of him, as we talked about in the film discussion, the whole point of the character, as he's introduced in Return of the Jedi, is to be the temptress. Then the temptation. He's the person who's supposed to seduce you into the dark. Like this is the most delicate part of that plan for him, just short of turning Anakin in the first place. This is the most tenuous he's going to feel with Vader, and it doesn't feel like that. And all the parts where it does feel a bit like that, it's just because he hasn't got a clue what he's doing. He's like, do I send him to Mustafar? Do I send him after the Jedi? Do I send him after this random senator who has nothing to do with Vader? Because the Force is vaguely telling me to. This
isn't your first apprentice, buddy. By the way,
and this is the apprentice. He specifically brings attention to, as is proper within the story, that he's never going to get one better, and if he got one even half as good, it would take him years. So this is an important piece of the board on the board for him at a time when he needs him, because he's teeing him up to be Lord Vader, the enforcer. If he fails, it should feel consequential, and it doesn't. It feels like he's just sort of flying by the seat of his pants with everything, which is not the vibe you want to be capturing with the Emperor in particular. But are we ready to step away from that and go into kind of the more positives of the book, because there is a lot of good here.
I was going to say, so it opens with Order 66, and it's in the what is the planet? Marcana? Is that the name of it?
Marcana, yeah.
This part of the book, this was where this worked most effectively for me. I feel all throughout that one of the problems with the book is that it's endless amounts of exposition about stuff we already know, and I mean like more so than usual. If you if you go into like your average Vader hunts down a Jedi story and they don't know really who Vader is, but we do, that's usually not like a game breaking sort of bug kind of a thing. We go, okay, they don't know he's Anakin. Doesn't really matter. They still are acclimating themselves to their situation. In this, similarly, it works well. This is the aftermath of like, it's still happening. It's okay for them to be really far behind. But once you get off of this portion, I feel like we're always being told stuff we already know, and so that's one of the issues with the book as a whole. One of the reasons why I personally feel a little bit like that crab that can't go home again, where it feels a little small for me. But this opening portion, that wasn't in any way evident or a problem. I thought that the Order 66 unfurling and people not sure what the order meant, and to the point where clone troopers are questioning it,
Yeah.
and the Jedi are completely like in tatters on
The clones in
how to
particular,
deal with it.
you've talked in the past about how you're not a big fan of them as personalities and not a big fan of them, just solely complying for it with all the changes they made, like the chips in the mind of the modern canon, etc.
I don't like the chip. I don't like the chips in the mind. I
Of
want to
course,
make
of course,
that
yeah.
Almost like, in retrospective, it almost kind of feels like it's funny that you mentioned that, because like there are various sequences in that where it even says very explicitly, it's like, oh, Order 66 wasn't hardwired into them.
Yeah, they specifically say there
like that.
wasn't a chip in there.
because that wasn't the way it was initially. It was not.
Exactly, and it's a dumb
This
idea.
is not my
opinion.
Going back in hindsight, it's very silly to read that again, because
exactly. But this got the balance really, really well for me. I felt like Clymer as an exception to the rule, but still noting that there are exceptions and how far that goes for them, etc., and how the rest of the clones react. I felt that this struck a really nice balance for the idea of, okay, there will be some, particularly because they took the time to set up why he's this way. He's just been saved by the very Jedi he's been asked to kill. He's just seen, in advance of not even that, it's not just he's been saved by them, because loads of clones have that. It's an expectation as part of their role for them. It was a teeing up of how, okay, I know how you think. I know how you puzzle through these kind of situations, these kind of ethics. Immediately following that, I'm being told you're a traitor. This doesn't line up. It helps sell the believability of the fact that they're not just machines. These are people. I mean, it's raised in the book as well that they've had lived experiences past the point of their programming that will, over the course of time, eventually overwhelm, no matter how powerful the programming. It addresses all of this and explains why the exceptions are there, and shows the exceptions have a character of their own. I really enjoyed all that. Did that strike the right balance to you guys?
That's one of the few lines I actually really like in this book, where he says, like, even eventually even a lowly soldier will become the sum of his experiences. That's also a very Lucino like writing, and I really enjoy.
Yeah,
and I think it also helps too that like they make a point of like addressing that like Clymer and his squad, they're commandos. They're not just basic clone troopers, and commandos are very specifically like created to kind of have a bit more independence from your average trooper. And obviously this also ties into like the clone commando, the Republic Commandos video game, as well as the Republic Commandos novels, which I've only read the first of, so my experience with those characters is a little bit limited. But I think it really does help that they made him a commando, and specifically a commando with those experiences you were mentioning, Callan, would be the most affected by this, because it even mentions that like, they're not quite as naturally independent as ARC troopers, but they're basically like the next deviation of that. So the fact that someone of his rank, of his experience, of his makeup would have these thoughts is very well done, because I think if it was just a basic squad of troopers, it might not ring, again, specifically in the context of this book and this era, it might not quite have rung the same way. So I appreciate that.
I want to say I'm fully on board with all that. My issue with the clones is when they kind of, like particularly with the show, The Clone Wars, I feel like they kind of became the point of it, which I think was a mistake. I really like having them used in this way, like having the potential to grow as characters and to have their own points of view. I just think that the idea of framing it as the whole war is like through their eyes, they should be like what they originally were in my head, which was like they're kind of like these living weapons that are just kind of performing a function of why they were created. But you do get these outliers, and it is something that is mostly born on the back of sort of military training, protocol, and secrecy. It's like it's a surprise to these ones even, but you don't question the orders, or you're not supposed to. And I also liked the kind of drama of like what happens to the clones in the original iteration of the EU. To me, it's a very sad story. They age more quickly than normal people do, so they're out of service by the time you get into the time of or almost entirely by the time you're getting into the the time of the original film timeline, and they were used to do things like in the Battlefront 2 story campaign. They're used to
Such
kind
a good
of
campaign, by the way.
yeah, they're used to put the Kaminoans back in line. Like the Kaminoans try to mount their own little rebellion with a new forged clone garrison, and those little stories they work really well for me. And again, the point being that by the time you're getting to like Luke's time, like when he's infiltrating the Death Star, most stormtroopers are just conscripts, and how the 501st and those like them had to like acclimate to like the new guys and never really got used to them. They're not really the same as us. And to me, that's a very interesting setup. I like clones. I just like them the original portrayal, and I do like this particular. There are several outliers that are their own characters or kind of had the capability to become that. Alpha comes to mind, the ARC trooper from the comics. But yeah, I liked Climber, and I liked the opening of this book, and that was also why I was struggling with the audio quality, because I remember I like this. How come I can't hear it? This is
Yeah.
where it's the most egregious. This is where the book is just too much. But
Among many of his great voices, by the way, the clone troopers, perfect. Like his
yeah,
voice
the
for
Clone
them
Troopers, yeah.
were absolutely
He's always been
fantastic
very,
standouts for
very
this.
good at that, at capturing the inflections. But
Mm.
I will say, I do think it was a really smart decision for them to open this book, concurrently with the climax of Revenge of the Sith, and seeing Order 66 and even aspects of the war itself, from an outside perspective. It actually reminds me a lot, ironically, of like Labyrinth of Evil, where they have like those like cutaway sequences that really delve into the war itself. I think that was a really smart move, because you could have easily have just I feel like, maybe if a different writer had written this, they probably would have opened it with the Vader, kneeling to Palpatine sequence when he's musing on the suit. But I do like that they used these opening chapters to not only introduce what are essentially our main cast, but also explore aspects of the war that I don't think necessarily came off really strong on film the way that they should have. So I think structurally that was a very smart move. And to your point, Matt, before, about seeing the Jedi scrambling to understand Order 66, the rise of the Empire, without having the full perspective, because we know what's going on, obviously, because we've seen Revenge of the Sith. But this planet, this outpost, these Jedi are very, very disconnected, and you even see them receiving the initial order to go back to the temple, and then later the order to to like stay away. I like the fact that they don't immediately put the pieces together. And even at the very end, even Shrine himself doesn't really understand, doesn't really get cued into everything until the very, very end. And I appreciate that, because it would have been too easy for them to have set it up in some sort of way for them to have learned everything too quickly. So I do appreciate that. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the Dark Times comics with like Crook and the Younglings, where it's like he's just trying to survive, and he catches news reports every now and then of the Empire, but it even notes that, like, things like this Empire or this Vader really don't mean much to him because he's so disconnected. It reminded me a lot of that. And although I do have my issues with the writing, I think that specific perspective with Roan and Oli trying their best to put things together, and ultimately only coming so far, is really nice. I do appreciate that.
It played really well with like you say, that confusion and dread in those early portions. The only issue I had with it is, one, like Matt said earlier, it kind of hung around a bit longer than it probably should have done, just for the sake of what the reader is knowing going into this. It kind of gets stale a little bit, particularly because they're doing it for every single individual character, like Bail and Mon Mothma later, for example.
Yeah, that's where it became too much.
Yeah. It just a hint too much. But also, the more important problem for me is that it's not plugged into the story of Vader and Palpatine. We don't get to see them playing in that space. We don't get to see them using that. We don't get to see how this confusion and dread that the characters are feeling ties into the main characters of this book, supposedly. The fact that this is the Vader and Palpatine piece. It should be, anyway, particularly Vader. And it doesn't feel like we're seeing any of this. It's just kind of they're off doing their own thing, and by accident inspiring all of this confusion.
When you see those same characters in the Revenge of the Sith and like Labyrinth of Evil, they're reacting to like the political checks that are being placed against them, and they're thinking about, okay, what's our next move? And in this, it almost feels like did you not go through the same movie you were just in? Like,
Mm.
it kind of feels like they're getting like a briefing on what they should just already be up to speed with. Now, granted, they'll still be wondering about the things they're wondering, like why is he doing this? You know, like what is the motive? What do we do in the aftermath? But it doesn't feel, it feels incidental. It's not really a character study about any of them in particular, and there's
Mm.
no pivotal scenes that the plot needs that pit them against the Sith or in positions where they're like central to what's going on with the Jedi, like for the most part. You know what I mean? Like there are exceptions to that. But it just
Yeah,
you get really deep into the book before any of those things start lining up, and that's what Lucino's normally like great at is the
Mm.
tapestry. Like I said, he's always good at weaving things together, and in this, it just isn't that. But
right.
what were you gonna say a bit ago, Evan?
Yeah, well, like to your point, it also really doesn't help though that a lot of the prose and the descriptions kind of set it up as though these particular Jedi and Vader do actually have a close rivalry, but it really just doesn't come up. Like there's this point like towards the end during the final battle where Vader's like, I mean, he does say this kind of sarcastically, but he's like, "Oh, I am your greatest rival, aren't I?" And it's like, "Oh, it's like okay, but
It's like,
like,
what does that
are you
mean
though?"
exactly? Yeah,
Yeah,
they didn't
first of all, what
didn't
does
get
that
that
mean?
at all.
No, you really don't. And also there are things too where it's like some of these like although I do like the outside perspective and like Shrine and Oli not understanding everything, like you also have moments where it's like we get like maybe four sequences where like Shrine is thinking to himself, could Vader be a Sith? Could Vader be a Sith? Could Vader be? It's like, but he
Well,
has
they actively,
even though by this
yeah.
point it's pretty, even though by like various points, especially towards the end, like you should kind of put these pieces together by now.
It's
Like you
pretty
would think.
I
academic
don't
anyway. Like,
even
who cares?
I don't
He's as big a threat as one at the moment. Beam a Grievous or a
Yeah,
Dooku or a
exactly.
Ventress,
yeah, I
whatever
don't
level he is, he's a
understand.
We
problem
spend
it's
so much
solving.
time on that. Like, why are we spending so much time on these particular musings? Like, I'm fine with him being afraid. I'm fine with him not understanding. But the fact that he dedicates so much of his internal monologue to trying to figure out something, like you said, Count, that's ultimately really doesn't matter either way. Is like we're just wasting time here. You know?
That
Mm.
stuff feels like it was kind of like written almost like trying to find the character as like an experiment. Like, okay, he's wondering about what he's up against, and it just never got redacted in future
Mm.
drafts because like you said, it does not matter. It really does not matter whether he's a Sith or not. But also, like, why would it be that unbelievable? You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Because you've just been fighting a war. Surely, Obi-Wan told everyone what Dooku said to him when he was in prison. That's got to be widespread throughout like a certain rung of like the Jedi order. Maybe not everyone knows, but like certain people in command positions. I think Yoda even says
Well,
that
yeah.
information was kind of guarded, but they've got to know. I mean, you know that Dooku switched sides. He
Shrine
famously
mentioned Sidious by name. Sorry, but he mentioned Sidious
Yeah.
by name.
yeah, and at some point the name Tyrannus came out, and the people were wondering who's that. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right, they don't know because, and also I never think of Darth Tyrannus like he is just Dooku, right? But I mean,
Yeah.
it is like who cares? You know what side he was fighting on. You know he trained Grievous. Grievous was famous. Is it they constantly talk about oh Vader's like the new Grievous maybe. I mean it really does not matter whether he's a Sith or not, and they actively argue about it several times. He and
Mm.
Starstone about like whether she's right to call him that or not, you know. And I guess his point was sort of about morale. But can we talk about the characters? We have not talked
Yeah,
about
I
them
was
at
going to
all.
say I
Like,
want to jump onto them now because they're the through of the
Yeah.
next part of the story anyway, when they're kind of gathering the
So,
crew
yeah.
together.
yeah.
So our two main Jedi characters in this book is Roan Shrine, a Jedi Master, and Oli Starstone, who's a Padawan. Roan Shrine is actually I don't know if
Order in
this
the films.
yeah, he's loosely based off an extra from I think like Attack of the
Yeah,
Clones.
the
Um
Geonosis scene. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, because they did yeah, and that's something else the book touches on. He was in the Battle of Geonosis and it's noted that he is a Jedi Master and he was considered like a member of the quote unquote old guard, people who were like of a similar generation who they thought maybe could rise to become a member of the council one day. They mentioned people like Obi-Wan being in a similar sort of block with, I mean, we obviously know Obi-Wan became a council master, but he never rose to that point. His main arc kind of centers on both, him coming to terms with his, new position in life as a fugitive Jedi, as well as his own personal misgivings about staying true to the Force and the Jedi way. His arc, his arc very much kind of comes to a head as to like basically he's kind of struggling with do I keep to the Jedi way or do I just try and forge my own path distinct from the Order because we essentially lost. Now, Oli Starstone is very much the antithesis to that, where she is actively trying to keep the Jedi flame alive as much as possible, with her young sort of outlook kind of clashing with Roan Shrine's more, seasoned sort of way of going about things. And they also make a point of noting that Shrine had multiple Padawans throughout
Mhm.
his career, and they all got lost to the war. And because of that, he's very protective of Oli, because even though she's not his Padawan in the strictest sense, we do see her master Bolshatak, who's a Zabrak, who was with them on this mission. She gets killed by Vader, and therefore Roan kind of takes her under his wing as a way of protecting her, even though she's constantly trying to locate other Jedi, bring the fight to the Empire, so on and so forth. So that's kind of the main dynamic that we follow throughout this.
And I agree with all of that on paper. In terms of what actually got executed, did not tick the boxes for me.
The ideas of her are more interesting. Also, I think she was supposed to take after Jocasta Nu in the archives if the war had ended, right? So I think more thought was put into making her like a character with legs as opposed to Shrine. He is not a bad character by any stretch of the imagination, but he is like a cardboard cutout Jedi stuck in the aftermath of Order 66, almost. You know what I mean? It's like he's there because a more famous one couldn't be. Yeah, almost. That's kind of how it feels to me. And I don't really have anything damning to say about him or her, but she obviously doesn't really go anywhere as a character. And he, again, these conversations they all have, they're good once or even twice, but they're too repetitive. And everything, it does feel a little bit like, I think one of you earlier said, it kind of could be two different books, two completely different stories almost. It almost feels like I kind of could have just done with it being about renegade clones and Vader whipping them into line, and then like have the Jedi stuff take place maybe a little bit after that in a separate book. Like putting it all together and then giving the Sith. I mean, there are times where it feels like Palpatine actively takes Vader out of something more interesting just so that other things can progress. We spend time with characters that I didn't think were bad, but I didn't need to know up close and personal, like the smuggler type, the Twi'lek. I forget his name.
Yes, yeah. Again, it's the classic Lucino effect of everyone he covers for the most part. Really good, really interesting, really fun. But it's not their story, so we don't need this time spent on it. It feels out of place and mistimed. All of these characters, I liked all of the crew. I liked all of the smugglers as a group and the Drunken Dancers crew. I think that
What about
I could follow a story about them. I could follow a trilogy about them if it was well, it was well told.
What about the integration of Shrine's mother into this?
That was random. I felt that came out of a little bit out of nowhere, which was obviously by design.
Like the odds of them running into each other. I do like what she represents in the sense of a Force user, because she's also a Force user. I do like the idea of like a Force user who actively did not become a member of the Jedi Order because their families refused to give them up. That is something that is touched upon in other works, but is never really explored heavily. So I do like, and I also like, because it even comes up in this book at a few occasions, like there are instances of Jedi running into like parents or siblings or distant relations while on mission. I think that's a very interesting idea, and I do like how it sort of frames Shrine's conflict in the sense of like, okay, he's a Jedi without a Jedi Order right now, and here he's getting his first introduction to his familial, connections, and they just happen to also, be Force sensitive. So I think a lot of those ideas are really interesting, but I just don't think we spend enough time with it to really play with those elements that I think we kind of should, because I think his and Jula's conversations are interesting in and of themselves. Like I like how she's very much, she's not she's not against the Force. She's just more against the sort of dogmatic sort of structure that the Jedi Order represented. And I think that in and of itself is interesting too, because Again, you could have easily made it where she's just very much against the Force, against the Jedi wholesale, but the fact that she is a Force sensitive and the fact that she does use her abilities, her limited abilities the to integrate with the life of a smuggler is interesting in and of itself. But again, like I was saying, if this had been like a book all about Shrine and we got to
Yeah.
see more of Jula's backstory and more of that perspective, and the fact that Shrine himself too, like his sort of connections, like he was originally slated to join the what do they call, like the Jedi
Acquisition
recruitment
Corps, yeah.
division. Thank you, acquisition. But
I hate that.
he
Yeah.
rejected it. And he didn't like what they represented, which then of course ties into, like, obviously it's framed as like the Force kind of telling him that this is an echo of what Jula believed, because she wanted to refuse that acquisition, but her husband, was the one who ultimately decided to give Shrine. Again, those are all very interesting elements that I think would work great at its own story. We just don't spend enough time with them to really stick the landing, which is kind of unfortunate.
It's something that I agree. Like it just feels like too much going on in this book, and that's not the one I would single out as like this is the worst thing in the book, not by far. It's just everything stacked on top of everything else. It's like the book just feels a little messy. Like, and I don't know exactly why that is. I don't know how it came to be. I'd be interested in reading a book about this book's construction and creation, sort of. But also the acquisition division of the Jedi Order, by the way, that it just sounds like such a corporation. I hate that. I hate that. But the fact that his parents' relationship went sideways because of this, because of the difference in point of view about surrendering children, that really could have just been its own book, like a book about that.
The thing she says about it as well, like the idea of the Jedi, the importance of love and all that kind of thing. She's an interesting character, and the whole crew is interesting. The dynamic they've got going on, but it's just particularly in relation to the randomness, it doesn't have anything tied together. It doesn't go anywhere. It's just something that happened.
Because of the fact it'd been so long away, I haven't read this book in close to 20 years, since the first time I've been through it. I actively thought when she says, "I'm your mother, Jedi," I actively thought, is this like a bad dream he's having? Like and he'll wake up, like, you know what I mean? Because it just feels so out of nowhere. And in large part, I won't say it's inconsequential. Obviously, she has a role to play in the book. But in the grand scheme, why is this story being told right now? So it very much is one that I'm conflicted about. I liked the writing, I liked the ideas. I did sort of wish it wasn't there. But it was also like, I feel like maybe things would have worked also had she kind of like inserted herself into his life a few times over the years without really this whole thing coming as complete as it is in this book. I think that you could have then at least had the seeds of like an anchor of like how this connects to his story and his rise and everything. It did really just feel like, oh yeah, the Jedi Order's toast. Oh, and here's my mother, my long lost mother.
That was the bit that was the biggest crime for me. He was literally stumbling through the very convenient aftermath of Order 66 for him. Like, oh, you don't want to be a Jedi? Here's your path, just handed to you on a whim. Which is in a story like Star Wars, that can work. I think it's weak anyway, but it can work if you use something like the Force as the kind of as the touchstone to that, and have it be the thing that ties everything together. But it doesn't go anywhere. There's no through line through the story that makes that make sense as to why the Force has delivered him this choice. There's no which world are you going to step between. Which what's the balance you're going to strike? What choice are you going to make? Runshine. What's your choice here that leads him to the ultimate confrontation with Vader? He just kind of stumbles through various things. Things happen. He just goes with whatever happens, and well, I guess now I've got to fight Vader because the story demands it. I mean, otherwise my sort of Padawan's going to die. I mean, there's no consistent kind of telling here. We don't there's no ebb and flow to this. It's just things happen and the characters respond. I like the characters. I like the way they respond. I like the dynamics. I like the things they say. I think it's all of this, greatness distilled down to the goodness level anyway, is littered all throughout this. But there's no cohesive tapestry tying everything together and knotting it in, particularly in connection with the fact this is Vader's book. For example, this would be a terrible idea, but just an example. The mother this could be taking years after Order 66. The mother could have been an agent from Palpatine that was threaded specifically because he knew about the connection to the Jedi in the past. He'd been, grooming her for solving this problem later down the line. right from the point that she had her baby taken away from her. That gives her a reason to turn up when she does. It gives her a connection to tie into Rowan. He's tempting her. She's tempting him away from the life of the Jedi as undoing a problem that Palpatine's facing with this particular rebel leader or whatever. That is not the way I would have gone for it, but it gives a reason for Palpatine to be involved in the story and using Vader. Vader's questioning use of a mother to manipulate a child. Is that something that he's agreeing with based on the fact that he's had that experience himself in his journey and Palpatine's influence? So all of this stuff, it gives you those kind of connective threads that make it all fit and make sense. But because anything like that, there's no mechanism or system in place to kind of show that. She's just something that happens to him along the way. She doesn't really change anything about his perspective because ultimately all of that happens from the impact of his Padawan, or he's not Padawan, Oli.
His sort of Padawan.
Yeah. Again, that dynamic, I really like that, particularly at the start of the book. The three of them together, I loved the dialogue between those three. They had a really fun, teasing, kind of mocking relationship between the three that kind of shows the banter, even with such a new dynamic they clearly established really recently. But
I love that line where he's all like, does she ever stop talking? And then Bowles Chatak is like, I've never been able to find the off switch.
Yeah, and just other things like that. The whole of their dynamic is brilliant. Chatak, I think, was great, except for the scene where she died. She just kind of died because she had to be out of the way. She was going to take up too much page space after that, I think, and to establish Vader as a threat. That was the point of that.
To establish Vader as the plan.
Exactly. She was fun before that, but up to that point, it's like, okay, now she's going away.
I do honestly kind of wish she stuck around until the end. Like I would have been. I actually think I might have preferred it if she had stayed alive, and then it was both her and Shrine fighting Vader at the end. Like them both dying there is fine enough. But again, like she was such an interesting character, and the fact that we lost her so relatively early on is kind of disappointing. I mean, honestly, like I think you could have done that sequence with Vader just fighting the clones who refused to execute Order 66, and I think basically the same effect would have.
This is the issue. The best stuff is at the book. You don't want to aspire to your worst moment in the book. Like, you know what I mean? It's like you want it to keep getting better and better, and it feels like it kind of peaks really early for me, which I was not expecting. I remembered liking the book, and I do still think it's a good book. I don't think it's terrible, but I think we're coming across the way we're coming across. I do that without apology, viewer. I'm not apologizing for what we're saying about it. I'm sorry if it's not what you're looking for, like if what you're waiting for. I think maybe it's a bit like that wine bottle I talked about, waiting so long to open and it comes out rancid.
Exactly.
But
There is a lot that this book does well. It's just that in comparison to what it could have been, in comparison to the other books in this specific trilogy, it really doesn't ring the same way. And I think that's what we're kind of coming from. Because in and of itself, it is.
I was going to bring that up. I wanted to bring that up earlier because, like, there are bits where, like when Anakin is Vader, whatever, like he's at war with his two sides, right, throughout this, and it's more like he's just has buyer's remorse. Yeah, you know what I mean.
Again, it's inviting out how does Anakin get from point A to point B here, because he's just got a real shit deal right now. It's trying to get those gaps in. Buyer's remorse is the way to put it.
Yeah, the bit where he's going on and on. It's a really long bitch fest, but it's well done. It's well written. It's just there's too many of these, and they do each scene is quite long, and it's not the character that you want to think of as whiny. You don't want to think of Vader as still being whiny, right? But when he's going on about the worlds he will never go back to because the memories will be too painful. I like that on paper, but like I said, it's the way it's constructed that it just feels unpleasant getting there, and it's one of several scenes like that. And then you tie it back to, because you mentioned the other books that he's done brilliant work with, or that both other authors have done brilliant work with in this trilogy. In Labyrinth of Evil, I never felt like that when, say, he was describing what made Grievous into what he is. That didn't feel like a long whiny slog. It was an in-depth character portrait, and there was hints of tragedy and malice and vengeance, and he comes out like this warped psychologically more so even than physically, like at the end. But I'm left with like this sort of resonant kind of there's a part of me that feels for this bastard. I ought to feel that several times going through like a Vader book, and I just don't. These scenes just don't quite. Nothing lands. Nothing's kind of bad.
Undercut by the secondary stories. Right? Well, I mean, the primary story that's supposed to be secondary with everything with the Jedi. It's making us not like Vader, which is undercuts all of that tragedy element that you're talking about there with his perspective. If we're
Yeah.
going to feel bad for him, we shouldn't immediately be seeing all of the things, all the people and characters that are suffering from him at the same time. There should have been a more gradual interwoven between that, potentially even time lapses.
I do feel like there's sort of a generational shift where people maybe a bit younger than we are, or people who just are more disposed to liking things like the Clone Wars or what have you. I think they view Anakin with a much different just set of sensibilities. They're much more predisposed to wanting to like him or to actually liking him than I've ever been. And there are times though when it's handled well, like Stover, and I want to close out with some of what Stover did in Revenge of the Sith to explain my thought process. But I'll get to that when we're ready to wrap up. I can be made to feel for Anakin and or Vader. This book just doesn't quite get me there. And with the other characters, the only weakness of it is it doesn't really feel. It's the construction of everything. It's too piecemeal. All these things could work. All of these things could work if this book itself was sort of a book one in a new trilogy or a duology or something. But it just feels like it's too much too fast, and none of it feels as consequential. And these days, 20 years later, there's nothing about it I'd call unique. And Lucino's normally good at that. He's usually bringing perspectives that you don't find anywhere else. Everything he does well here. Maybe it's the timing of it. I read this in comparing it to other books. We went through this after we've been through Heir to the Empire. Compared to Heir to the Empire, like you know what I mean? The things that gets so right, this does well, but not better. Nothing better, And then there are things like, for reasons that are probably obvious to anybody who's sufficiently well informed about what's going on today in the world. I've been spending some time with 1984, George Orwell, and that book was one that, like most people, I was made to read in school, so I kind of had a resentment towards it. It was an imposition. It wasn't something. It was a chore. But looking at it now, I mean, it's very, very well written, and that also is painting a picture of a newborn dystopia, and so it's a new authoritative regime and acclimating itself to that, and the use of language. I mean, Orwellian prose. I mean, he's got a form of writing named after him, so he's obviously like a gravitic shifting, sort of force, right? But it's famously sparse and just efficient. That's the way. That's what people mean when they're talking about Orwellian prose. Lucino is different, but I think he gets quite close to it in terms of like he uses $5 words. I talked about orbiculate
There's one
flora.
in this, by the way. There's one near the end of this book that I meant to jot down as I heard it. I can't recall what it is off the top of my head.
We'll break and you can look it up. But he does reach for those $5 words. But when you're reading Plagueis or Labyrinth of Evil, when he's just on with the business of setting up, what you're looking at and like the stark reality, he can really be hard hitting, and I think this is his least effective book for me in that, which is surprising. And it is maybe it's poor timing comparing it to the Heir to the Empire or something
we
like
are holding up
1984.
against the absolute greats of some of Star Wars. Dark Rendezvous, Heir to the Empire, Plagueis. These are peaks of the franchise. So yeah, it could be that. But even without that, I feel like the inconsistencies and things that we're feeling would be true even if we were holding it up against the average books.
It actively feels like someone else wrote some of these scenes, as we said, like that ghost written quality. Some of it just doesn't feel like Lucino, and it's not bad per se, but it's not great. At least in my opinion.
Not Lucino, yeah, exactly. It's
not
Lucino.
Because
what are you thinking, Evan?
Yeah, because so like getting into more of like a story structure. So it's like we follow Shrine and Oli as they actually contact a group of other Jedi, and they start to form like this little like coalition, and Oli very much is the one kind of taking charge of this band, even though she is one of the youngest present. I do like how they sort of emphasize the fact that she's essentially leading by force of like just personality and determination, which I think really does speak to her character and her ability to kind of laser focus in. But this ultimately leads to them accepting. Again, it's just like a weird contrived conveniences where it's like they just so happen to accept a mission to try and smuggle Fang Zar, one of the senators of the delegation of the 2000, off Alderaan, and then again Vader just so happens to go there because Bail Organa is such a prolific figure in the galactic,
pain in
the
Palpatine's
Imperial
ass.
Senate. It's the Imperial Senate now. I do like the fact that they established that he is still as outspoken as ever, kind of following on from, Revenge of the Sith and his final promise to Padme, which gets actually direct mention in this book. So I do like that. But the fact that all of these things sort of coalesce, where all of these figures just so happen to be on Alderaan, which is, again, just more convenient. As we get 2 chapters also featuring C-3PO and R2-D2, which
Didn't
is
need them.
entirely
Did not
pointless.
need to be here.
Why,
Complete waste of time.
why they were there makes
Again, done well,
absolutely no
but we didn't need it.
not in the slightest. And then this sort of ultimately culminates in the death of Fangzar getting killed by Vader. Shrine tries to defend him, but that doesn't end up working out, and Jula gets, horribly injured.
Thank God she didn't die, by the way. If they'd done the mother dies trope in that seat, I was like, oh, no, thank God they didn't do that, because
that would have been way too much. I will say, for such a prolific figure in the plot, Fangzar himself gets surprisingly little to do in this book, which is kind of strange. He is very much a walking plot device, which is
he's the
weird.
MacGuffin. He's
especially for a character that was
basically.
like in the films and all that, for such a high-ranking member of the delegation. I don't know. It really just came off as a waste to me. But
we put in the notes we wanted to talk about Alderaan briefly. The main purpose of that was to touch on the Bail Organa material, right? Because that was I really enjoyed that in this book. I thought Bail was brilliant, and voice was perfect, by the way, for the audiobook. Another strength of it. But on top of that, just the writing and the prose. For someone who didn't need to be in this story and shouldn't really be in this story, the material that was chosen for it, I thought was very strong. It kind of captured the bit of that Lando in Bespin, Cloud City kind of energy for me quite effectively, just with a different tone to it. Because obviously he's got the issue of Leia to worry about. I thought that was all kind of very well handled, and I liked that the real nugget of relevance to it and thing that makes it me glad that it's there is it tees up everything that's going to be happening with the rebellion and his ties to Mon Mothma. I love the that had a purpose here and had a presence in the story that should have been kept, just woven in better, because obviously Mon Mothma and Bail and their likes, Gunbear Iblis and such is touched on here as well. They are the counter to Palpatine. They're the counter force in the galaxy now. The Jedi are waning, and until they are fully gone, they're still obviously much more relevant. But once the Jedi are fully diminished, the rebellion and the roots of it, which are those 3 as a trio, are the biggest counterforce. So we needed to see more of that in the background of this for it to fully function and feel, like a Dark Lord of the Sith, like a Vader, like a Palpatine story. I would have liked to have seen them better thread into this. I would have liked, to be honest, I would have taken this book in three act form and then split a time jump between each of them, at least 2 of them anyway. So the Order 66 experience was only the first third of the book, and then we transition more into a early rebellion phase where we're getting to see some of the kind of Andor material with Mon Mothma setting up the rebellion stuff, and then the fruits of that later on as well. I'd have liked to see the Jedi grow through the experiences, to see Oli and Roan having experienced Order 66, made the choices they'd made, and then lived with them, and then come to the end of the story with perhaps the Vader encounter there at the end, leading into the start of more towards the original trilogy material. I think that would have been made for a much more lived in and interconnected story that let all of this great character work breathe, because it is all good. It's just mostly not relevant and mostly inconsequential and mostly just kind of feels like a plot thing that has to happen to get the story moving along. It doesn't feel like any of it's really tying together. If he'd gone back and re-edited this and just kind of done another final draft to tie all this together, this I think could have been a much stronger piece, and I think that requires the time skip, personally.
Well, yeah, and to your point, Callan, if they had done that with the time skip between the different acts, it also would have helped to have somewhat justified Vader's rather abrupt change in characterization and comfortability with himself, his connection to the dark side in that time frame, because enough time has gone by, and since we don't see a lot of that actually on the page, that would have kind of helped bridge that a little bit, because again, there's like a lot of, we're told that he's coming to terms with himself, we're told that he's moving with greater agility than he had earlier in the book, we're told that his faith in the dark side has been affirmed, but we're just not really seeing that directly.
Why is that?
If they had done that, that actually would have I wouldn't say it would have justified it, but it would have at least, made it a little bit more believable.
Particularly because it comes at the end of him killing. Okay, he got that because he killed the Jedi. Like, great, he killed multiple other Jedi in his book. What makes this Jedi so special exactly? There's nothing explaining that. It's just, he was more of a challenge, I guess, and came after I'd sort of grown a bit by that point. Yes, it's just there's nothing here that's kind of tying us together.
I wanted to say, like what you said a few moments ago, and that was also well said, Evan. But what you said earlier, I didn't have your idea, Callan, about the time skips. I think that that's a really great note. Like if you were in charge of editing this one, I think that would have kind of saved this book or made it like a real star, like as opposed to just another Star Wars book, that exists and is good and serviceable for what it is. I think that would have elevated it to the level of its peers in this same trilogy. But what your point about the senators, basically the political movers and shakers, that is usually like where I feel Lucino's heart lies. Like that's usually what I think he likes. And there's a part of me that wonders whether that isn't initially what he went for, and he was told no, Vader's more like a like Vader's the enforcer. He's got to go get his hands dirty. He can't he can't come in and punch Mon Mothma and choke Bail Organa. He can't do that. You got to have Jedi and whatever.
A political story with Vader is like a real threat in that sense. That has not been done before. That would be so.
That's what
good.
it wants. That's what I think it wants to be.
Empire-esque.
I would much prefer that. I would much prefer that. And I think that that's my issue, is because they're also key to, those characters, aside from Anakin, Vader, Anakin/Vader, and Palpatine himself, those characters now are the ones in this book who have links not just to the story and the setting really, but to the other previous books in this trilogy. We've seen them peppered into Labyrinth of Evil and Revenge of the Sith. And it's them. I don't love Padme's the way that her character was always kind of hamstrung by not having wonderful scenes, and being part of terrible scenes. But a lot of her better moments, particularly in Revenge of the Sith novel, deal with those characters. They're kind of carrying on. If she's supposed to be one of the would-be Leia of her time, but she's killed before she can do anything, then they're carrying on her mandate, really, and so it's sort of like, that is the story I want to see. But then it's like, no, you got to go do a Jedi thing, and this is right after Order 66, so they're all in the trenches, and, But I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's the book I think I would have preferred, is if it was more of a Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, Vader piece, and the Jedi kind of blinking out like lights, like what it is.
Yeah.
Macro scale, the Jedi are quietly, maybe not so quietly, but you know what I mean, like being
Kashyyyk burning in the background.
So it's like I don't necessarily need all that. I much prefer this, and it's when Vader feels the most like Vader. It's when he feels the most scary.
When he asks to see his wife. Brilliant moments, and
I'd like to meet the Queen.
I'd like to meet the Queen, exactly. And when Mon Mothma, when he's in the room with the politician and Palpatine stuff, like he notes in his head the fact that this person is trying to gauge how he's supposed to deal with him, and like how he's slotting him into the kind of ranks of power, etc. How he's supposed to address him, if he's supposed to stand, he's supposed to invite him to sit. Little pieces like that. If that had been the kind of main focus of the story, and we'd got to see how the politicians are dealing with this new tectonic shift in the political situation, and how they're also, like we talked about the stuff we talked about Andor, we haven't actually probably talked about it yet, we will do soon, but the stuff with Mon Mothma, like everything about setting up the rebellion, that is fascinating stuff, and that's all without ever touching Vader, someone who is a literal living, breathing, physical threat within the space, within the scene. Having that be this story would have been really strong, all amidst his also giving him time amidst the stuff, he's struggling to become a Jedi level threat at the moment because he's still getting used to the suit and his new style and everything. That wouldn't be a problem because he's dealing with non-forceful entities.
Yeah. Well, and speaking to your point about like Kashyyyk being on fire, the climax of this book actually takes place on, Kashyyyk. We get this essentially the.
What about the attack on the Wookiees?
Yes.
Is this your pivot to that?
It feels a little bit like, hey, let's give some further context to why this was suddenly so important that the Grand Master of the Jedi Order left to go deal with it, which is never.
Again,
I've always
damage control.
Yeah, I've always
Mm.
hated this. Not this in this book, but I'm sorry, but like, just I know Chewie's old. He's been around for like 200 years or something. The idea he was palling around with Yoda, and then like a few scant years later, really, he's like around with Han Solo, who just has no regard for any of this.
And he never
None of this
mentions
Force
anything.
stuff.
This
He
this
never
this book
talks
is
about it.
always what makes me raise
Yeah.
the question of like when Han's talking about a bunch of Holcomb and should we
Yeah,
just
like,
like
where'd you dig up that old fossil? And he doesn't know anything about all this.
Chewie's just sitting there playing chess in the background.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it doesn't work.
you
Yeah.
would think
I know
you would.
people like some things are tongue in cheek, and maybe some people might think I'm taking it too seriously, but I just find it kind of shattering
It's
to
very
the,
funny.
the whole tapestry,
Yeah,
But anyway,
Sorry, Evan, I didn't mean to
yeah.
derail your point. I was just making a
No,
drawing
no,
track
it's
on the
fine.
Wookiees joke.
It's like no, but you're right though. Like some things just can't be fixed. I will say, I mean, I've always loved Kashyyyk as a setting. I do really like the fact that having recently reread Heir to the Empire, and the fact that it talks about like the Wookiees' like unique technology and their unique way of like using the trees to kind of make their cities and stuff. I like the fact that this book also heavily emphasizes the uniqueness of their world, their technology, their society. Um, I just think that that's really well portrayed, and it's actually very, very similar to how Timothy Zahn described Kashyyyk. And
We
obviously, there's a lot.
we
By the
keep
time
coming
this was
back.
written, there
All
was
the
a lot
books we're
more
reading when
content
we
to
keep
the
ending
planet,
up on
and that was
Kashyyyk, don't we? It's the same space.
it's interesting, but I like that continuity, and it is very well handled. And I also like the fact that they emphasize the fact that even though the Wookiees being, basically born warriors, I like the fact that they emphasize if this entire system, rebels, like the Wookiees would become like, I think they say something like, a rebellion, the likes of which the Empire, could never dream of. And that's nice little continuity with the fact that a lot of Wookiees end up joining the, Rebel Alliance later down the road. So I like how those, again, planting seeds to things that will eventually, sprout into, much bigger stories is also appreciated. It is a little odd when you consider the fact that Vader is going to be returning to this planet in like a few months to discover, Galen Merrick and the Force Unleashed.
he didn't know that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
It's just, although it does make you wonder where Kento Merrick was, what he was doing during all this. Like, I don't know. But
If they'd known that about then Kenta Matt would have been Rowan Shrine, and Rowan Shrine would have survived this attack. Like it would have just been connected like that.
Pretty-
That was how they usually
yeah.
handle that kind of thing in Star Wars.
It is just a little odd when you think about it, when considering how closely those events in the timeline.
It's also
happened.
funny because I don't like the Force Unleashed much, but the one thing I do like about that story is kind of Palpatine's machinations creating, like, or sort of cementing, like the rebellion, like being like an active thing, as he wanted to draw them together so he could off them, and it turns out that he gave them like sort of a martyr figure and like a new like kind of a jolt in the arm for the cause and everything. So I liked that irony there. So that was the one thing I thought was really especially well done in that story.
Also, would Thom, Trassa, and Quinlan Voss be on the Kashyyyk at this time, or would that be, or would Quinlan still be recovering?
I can't recall the time frame of things.
Because
I haven't read that comic, and I've been holding off.
It's a few weeks,
that's
if not months later, by that point anyway, when they return to Kashyyyk, right? Because it's been a certain amount of time because they've looked at a few
I
other
think it
planets.
says like
and checked
9
in-
months, like 9 months, because obviously his son would have to have been born.
That's the last time we see them, or Voss anyway. Trassa obviously shows up much later on, but but I haven't looked at that in years because I thought we eventually will do that for this channel.
I'm sure we will.
But I thought that back when the viewers were initially expecting this review, so like 8 years ago. So it's been a really long time since I've looked at Voss's later arc, So I can't recall the details, but you're right. They do wind up there. That's where he's attempted to. That's where they attempt to take him out.
Yeah, maybe he was just recovering at the time, which is fine. But it's like, again, it's weird timeline shenanigans. That plus the Force Unleashed thing. It's like wow, like Vader's really.
I mean, because he was hurt during the same time where they in the original version. This is where Luminara Unduli was killed. Yeah. I don't know what happened with Unduli. I know that she was kind of like her corpse was snatched or something, and like in the new canon or something in Rebels, they like tried to use her as. Yeah, but she was initially just killed on Kashyyyk, and that was it. But Yeah, I remember she was there. Like I remember the artwork of her being there in the arc when he was killed. But yeah, because she's in the
Yeah,
film. I think you can see her pointing at
Mm.
something during a
yeah,
montage of something.
yeah.
But
Because she's because both her and Voss are name dropped as in this book as being
mhm.
on Kashyyyk along with Yoda. It's
Mm.
just again, it's just odd continuity when you consider
Well,
that
but also
completely.
he had a because the last time we see him, spoiler alert, there's like a new addition to the family, right? And so like, and
Yeah,
I can't, so I can't, yeah, I can't remember the timeline of things on that, but
I imagine he's probably like still recovering at this point,
yeah,
but it is so even if that's the case, that's fine. It is just kind of odd
but
that
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 is funny because those are some heavy hitters, like
Mm.
yeah.
so the group
It
as a
always
whole,
bugs me where obviously
But
it's the
like
nature of the
Kento Merrick
story and
just
the world, but
really doesn't make much sense because we know that he is definitively on the world at the time with young Galen. So
Again,
I don't
they hadn't made the game yet, so I'll give him
yeah.
that one. It's like that's kind of there was nothing he could do about that,
It
you
does
know.
always bug me though. Again, I understand it's the world it's setting is how it works, but just the number of Jedi that are just sat on their ass during the dark times, not really doing anything, is
Well,
too
Yoda
damn
and
high.
Obi-Wan are like
And yeah,
the
again,
most
Obi-Wan
relevant
and
ones.
Yoda, like the dereliction of duty. When I mean, that's something that's a big touch on the story. The fact that Rowan Shrine just instantly gives up. Like he's like, well, time to not be a Jedi. Then
Well,
order's
that's what
gone.
I
It's
thought you
like
were going to say that a long time
I
ago
was
when
gonna
I
say,
teed it
yeah,
up. What do you think of the
dereliction of duty,
characters? I was
dude. The
surprised you
Padawan's
didn't
doing a
say
job.
that. Yeah,
Yeah, the
yeah,
Padawan's doing a
exactly. I
job.
was like, he just went to pieces.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
I wasn't a big
Yeah,
fan of that, but yeah, she even talks about
this
Oli
yeah.
mentions it. If Yoda's alive, like Yoda doesn't lose. If Yoda's alive, he's gonna find us. He's gonna say, yeah, no, Yoda's gone to Dagobah and he's gonna sit like a hermit for 15 years, waiting for a random kid to be the savior of the
this
Jedi.
is also
It's
why
always
it's
been a
funny
bit of
for
like
yeah, it's silly. It's also this is why it's funny for Palpatine to just be like the Jedi. Then we got them all. It's like, well, you didn't. You know that
yeah.
there's like at least
Right.
one major one that you did not
And he
handle
even in this
yourself.
book's reference, it's not like you think his power is
Yeah.
broken and I do not have to worry about him now. He specifically says like, you remember you lost to Obi-Wan. Imagine what Yoda would have done to you. Like if you're talking about him as in those terms, he's a threat. He's
Right.
out there.
Yeah.
The rebellion
You literally
that's going to be brewing inevitably because it hasn't been cemented
yeah.
yet, hasn't even been properly thought up. But he knows there will be something that comes to oppose him, and if it's got Jedi in its ranks, it's going to be a bigger problem to deal with than otherwise. So,
Mhm.
as it should have
I
done.
also but also like getting back to the battle, I also think it is kind of strange. It seems like they sort of it's weird because like they very heavily emphasize the fact that the Wookiees are such formidable fighters, which I like. But at the same time, it also feels like they kind of just take the planet kind of easily. Like they first of all, they mentioned that there are only like 4 megacities in the entire planet, which is very hard to believe because Kashyyyk is massive and there's like a lot of Wookiees. I think that might have been retconned later, but it
But
just
it's a
kind of feels
wild
like
place, so
they
you could argue that it was very difficult to survive. So all
maybe
the focal points of survival were very focused and not spread out. Like you can get well built hand
sure.
wavy for that. But
It
the
just
only way it
feels
explains that they did conquer so
odd.
quickly is they did just bombard it. Like they did obliterate these
Yeah,
places they were just too lazy to take effectively.
sure. I
And
could believe that. I just feel like it should have been sort of, if that was the case, that should have kind of been put at the forefront a little bit more strongly in order for us to really sell it. To
Mm.
that though, I do like certain like again, and we have certain little writing quirks here that I really like. Like I like how it notes that like when Vader goes on to the battlefield and fights the Wookiees, like it notes that he's like as tall as, almost as tall as some of them, kind
Mm.
of little things like that to sort of emphasize, the threat that he's represents and the fact that he is literally just slaughtering these Wookiee warriors left and right, and the fact that it's built up is such a huge deal. And I also like the fight with the Jedi itself, the fact that he's literally getting swarmed by this big group, and again he's just almost effortlessly just weighing into
Yeah,
them.
unfortunately, they didn't
In
bring
the
quite a strong plot armor as he's got.
yeah,
If Shrine had
his
been there at the
improvement.
same time, they'd have won.
Yeah.
But no, Dark Times
Yeah,
plot
yeah.
armor.
Or maybe, or if Bolshetak had survived and stayed on too, she
Uh,
might have been able to do a little bit more.
it's always the
So
Vader
I
problem.
like,
We always
yeah,
know how
I
they
like
end.
all that, but things just things just happen because they happen. Rowan Shrine comes back, and this actually kind of annoys me. Like the fact that he just kind of vanishes from the plot from several chapters and just shows up and just said, "Oh, I'm a Jedi again. I've
Deus
decided
Ex
to."
Machina himself back into the sequence of things. Yeah.
But we really did need a chapter dedicated to him kind of struggling with that decision and ultimately deciding to go back. Like that was sorely needed, and it really
I
kind of shocked
honestly
me
think
that we didn't
I,
get that.
I really do think his initial treatment as an author for this story was probably exactly what Callan suggested, that this was a senator-driven rebellion story, and then at some point said, no, make it Jedi so Vader can be Vader in the field. I really think Roan Shrine is like an afterthought in that sense. Like, I really don't feel like Lucino's interested in his character, and that's why that's why
It
you get a
definitely,
situation like that. Yeah.
yeah. You get a fight, which in and of itself is fine. I do like the fact that the way like Vader, I mean Vader basically just defeats him by pelting him with wood, wood planks and all that.
Well, he's doing.
Which,
See, that's the thing.
It's the Luke
There's
thing.
every now and then there's like what did he say? There was a phrase he used. He criticized somebody's like lack of faith or something, or he came close to that line. Every now and then there's like I don't know. There are times where it's great, and there are times when it's kind of a
Sloppy.
hack move.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's some real rough
and
edges in this fight in particular. Like he's talking about, you don't know the power of the dark. He doesn't actually say that, but the power of the dark side was overwhelming. No, it's not. It's just telekinesis. You could be doing this,
yeah,
Rowan, if you were stronger in the Force than you
it's
are. It's being
it's
pelted by
very
rocks is not
clearly an
the dark
homage
side.
to, yeah. It's very clearly an homage to that scene in Empire Strikes
Yeah.
Back when he's pelting Luke with all the machinery and stuff, but this doesn't have nearly the same level of dread or intimidation, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
I like the
Also,
touch
it's
in
worth
that he
noting
is
too that
struggling
like
to beat him. He has to go to that level. I like the fact that he can't beat him
yeah,
as a swordsman in his current state. That's cool. That's consistent with the character they've portrayed with Rowan thus far, and the struggles that Vader's facing at this time. So I like that he had to draw on that to overpower and beat him. The way it was framed, it made it sound like it was like drawing on the great high Sith arts, and he
yeah.
just really wasn't. He was just using telekinesis.
Yeah, it is also very much implied that like Roan was probably like speaking of like heavy hitters like Matt. I definitely got the feeling that they were trying to set it up as Roan he was a heavy hitter who just kind of flew under the radar because of his own sort of self doubt and his own sort of
yeah,
dislike of
they kind
wanting
of
to be in the
they kind of
spotlight.
gave him some kind of like scout kind of manacles just to hedge it there, just to kind of hinder him as a character. But I mean, as you guys said, the so-called old guard would have been like of the Kenobi, Kit Fisto generation of character. You know what I mean? He's like if they were considering him as being somebody like that, then surely when all cylinders are firing and he's in the right frame of mind, he certainly could have been like a real force to be reckoned with. And I guess in some sense he was. But I mean, it just is. I really feel like his character just isn't where Lucino's heart was, and was kind of
Yeah.
almost like driven by editorial mandate. Like he must have a conflict with a Jedi. And you look at the film. Well, all the famous ones died, or they're MIA. So it's like I guess I gotta
Yeah.
do this one.
Here's an extra from Attack of the Clones I could use.
Sort
But
of.
yeah,
Yeah.
also it's worth noting too that like Shrine has like a vision early on in the book, and it kind of comes back to him as he's about to die, like a forest world burning, a big flash of light in the sky. Obviously, he's referencing Endor at the end of Return of the Jedi. Like that's meant to be a allusion to the fact that he saw that. I do like I do appreciate that they keep it ambiguous enough without directly saying it, because that just would have been very schlocky for them to have really like dropped Endor by name, or him to have actually seen the Death Star blow up. I do like how they keep it vague enough to where yes, we know what he's seeing because we've seen Return of the Jedi, but from his perspective, what he's seeing now is what he imagines that to be. So I do appreciate that.
But again, his foresight
but also, why is
is
he
not a
having
part
that
of the
vision?
story. Yeah, he had a
Because
vision at the
it's time
start, he has a vision at the end, and that's it. There's no
the book
connective
needs to.
struggle with that. There's no connective
That's what it is.
interpretations.
Yeah.
It's just the hell of it.
It's
Yeah.
just because without that, this really would just feel. I think again, I keep using the word haphazard, and I think in the end, it still gives that kind of energy. But those little touches like those there are at least attempts to make this. If you didn't have those things, I don't see how you could justify making this the third entry in a trilogy like that.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
Right.
Like it just wouldn't work. So you have to have it. You have to give it these. I don't want to say this false air, but it's just not as well honed as it could be of having something to do with a larger story. You know?
particularly for someone like
yeah.
Lucino.
And
Yeah.
then,
Also,
yeah,
in that
so
particular example, does anyone else feel like it's always the big middle finger from the Force to the Jedi? It's like, oh yeah, I'm still with you. You're definitely going to win at the end. You honestly are. But you all have to die first for like 15 years, and
Well,
you'll be fine with that.
I don't.
It's just like,
I've never
why is
really
the
looked
Force
at
kind
it.
of just doing this?
Well, because this is the thing about the whole. I really think I think a lot of that is because the Jedi don't ever express what they think bringing balance to the Force means. It's implied that to wiping out the dark side.
Yeah,
That's
which is
implied
definitely
what they
obviously
seem to
isn't
think.
the case.
Yeah. But so it's like the Jedi can be wrong about things. I don't mind that. But this whole thing. I mean, Lucas is the one that says in interviews, Darth Vader does become the hero. I humbly disagree, sir.
Nope.
Like he's not the hero.
He's
So it's like
really stretching
the
definition.
whole
2%
the-
redeemed and exclusively in a selfish approach because he was saving his son. If it was a random stranger, it'd be different, but it's his son. He doesn't care about right or wrong. It's like, I don't want my son to die. That's not the same thing.
Yeah, it's you can say he does destroy the Sith. That's objectively correct and true. He does do that, and he plays a role that is sort of ironic in a prophetic way. But he is not the hero. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. He destroys himself and his master. Right. I got. Yeah, but but it is just yeah. But it is just like if that's explanation enough for you as a viewer or reader or whatever, I think your mileage on all these things vary is what we're getting at. It's like if this works for you, then great. But yeah, personally, I'll save my thoughts for when we're doing the wrap up. It is kind of as a plot. I don't want to give the impression that this book is bad. It really, I've read much worse. It's more like what the kids call mid to me. You know what I mean? It's like it's good character work, mid plot, and sort of just messy. There's no
and the overall story is not thread together. That's the great crime. It's not all of the stuff it's doing well is not into the service of a good story. It's just good scene work and good character work and good dialogue. All that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, like we can like move into the wrap up because all that really happens with the plot at this point is like Shrine dies, Kashyyyk gets occupied, Starstone and the few surviving Jedi decide to disband their group and sort of go on their own, work covertly to continue the Jedi way and bring down the Empire in whatever way they can. I definitely feel like they were teeing up a series following Starstone that just never materialized because she literally does not, as far as I know, she does not appear in the story.
I've never.
I really don't think
never to be seen or heard from again.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Her
presumably,
name-
is a foundational stone behind the rebellion, but you can only guess.
Her name is also it's the most Star Warsy name of a new character introduced here. So I mean, it does feel like that's who they want her to be, but it just never happened.
Yeah.
And one of them goes to
bit of
manufacture the Death Star trench floor as well.
Yeah, we get a little wrap up with Vader self-reflection, his new spot at the head of the Empire, his sort of peace with himself, his peace with his suit, and his sort of desire to find an apprentice of his own one day, learn the Sith arts, and eventually overthrow Palpatine. Literally, his last recollection is like it gives him something to live for, and that's kind of where we close on that. We then,
which isn't something he's been struggling throughout the rest of the book. Really, it's just it's kind
apparently
of alluded to, but it's never like a core problem, so it's
then,
not a resolution to anything the way it should be.
Yeah, we then get a final sequence on Tatooine with Obi-Wan Kenobi.
No comment.
Yeah, again, nothing
No
to say.
comment.
Like the only thing that's really worth pointing out here is the fact that we see Obi-Wan learns of what happened on Kashyyyk from an Imperial broadcast. Why they're broadcasting this all the way in Tatooine, who knows? But
hey man, you gotta know what's going on in the spaceways for all your crooked business endeavors. You gotta know. You gotta see what's been said. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. And he learns that Darth Vader is alive, and that obviously, shakes him to his core because he had been under the impression that Anakin had died. And
I've always been so like confused by that. I mean, it's just the idea that the chosen one would have died and I didn't feel it. I just walked off and left. I assumed
this whole scene to me, theoretically it worked, but I found it so comical when he's standing. Oh my god! He's flipped the table over in his panic shock, like Obi-Wan. Ewan McGregor Obi-Wan. He's like, and then some random guy. No, it's okay.
Like
and then
yeah,
exactly. A message in his head from Qui-Gon is, all is well. It's okay. I'm fine. it's just seems so comical. Also, who was the guy he was talking to? Is it supposed to be implied as one of the crew members from the rest of the book? Like I was thinking maybe it was the mother, Julie, at one point, because the voice that was being done in the audiobook, but it's never stated.
I don't know.
Yeah. I actually think it might have been someone connected to that Twi'lek guy, but I don't remember.
It was just very confusing the way it was shown.
But basically, like, he thinks to himself, like, what, should I do something? And then to your point, Calendar, is that he hears Qui-Gon. Qui-Gon's like, nah, just stay where you are. You'll be fine, And
Anakin doesn't like sand. Remember, you're fine. Okay, sure, great.
yeah. And then of course Owen and Beru, Lars and baby Luke just happened to be in the city at the time he comes stumbling out of the bar. So he kind of just sees them.
Well, I think the impression there is that he was actively following them, but that was by choice. It was just being closer to them for security's sake. The fact that he's one of his little check-in kind of thing.
He's waiting to give him the model toy. He has to do that.
It's just he's just been saving up for.
So we get a little, we get a segment of Obi-Wan being committed to his mission, thinking to himself that New Hope will rise one day, and binary sunset, cue credits, dun 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 dun.
All of this again could have been better set up if we'd spent more time with Mon Mothma and Bale and everything being said about the stakes of having Leia be revealed and all of that stuff as a background drop to the political stuff again. This all would work much better. You could spend more time with Obi-Wan.
Can I just say my little spiel that I've been
jump straight into
that?
We'll wrap up now.
Yeah, I think that this book is again, it's good, not great. There are good things about it, and I know we've been quite negative, but a lot of that is just because, to me, it was kind of shocking. I was expecting it to be much better than it was, like revisiting it. And again, I'm comparing it to books I like much better than this, both in universe and out. I'm reading things like 1984, paints a much more grim picture of like a dystopian new reality for people, and obviously it's resonant today in a way that this wasn't when I first read this. And then there's just other books, whether written by Lucino or not, that are just so much more classic or just feel much more consequential. My question about like why should you read this in 2025, I don't really have a good answer for you. It is kind of, I guess, what Callan said, read it if you wanna. I don't think you need to. And there have been many times where I've read Labyrinth of Evil and Revenge of the Sith and not gone on to read this one. And I was thinking about like, why is that? Is there like a actual reason, or am I just lazy? I really think it's because of how Stover did just so well. I think that this book was kind of hamstrung by the fact that Matthew Stover wrote such a perfect ending, like for Revenge of the Sith. And it's from pretty much every perspective. When you're thinking about, like, you keep mentioning, Callan, the senators and the political movers and shakers, I mean, you get the sense of that little ember of rebellion just in there. From like the perspective of the Jedi, things are completely shattered, but they talk about the nature of stars, and there are all those poems that go about like how the darkness is patient and it will win, and that stars do die, but they're also born, and so it's like that leads a little bit of a nugget of hope. You have all these pieces that just feel so ready to skip straight to the original trilogy after that. Like they all just feel so complete. And for me, that was also true of Vader in a way that I didn't quite realize. It was really hammered home by seeing this, because I'm not going to read the entire thing because it's long. But you remember in that book has a series of moments where during pivotal moments in Anakin's portion of the story, you get, this is how it feels to be Anakin Skywalker right now. You know what I mean? And so it's like when he's about to take on Dooku, he has like this vision of like victory, and we're gonna bring it home for the Republic, and brighter days are coming. Later on, he's stressing the hell out. He can't get any sleep, and he thinks his wife's gonna die, and no one's helping him, and he's going nuts. How does it feel? He's describing all that anxiety and that fear and that sense of isolation. It's perfect. And then the last one, the most haunting one, the most perfect one, this is how it feels to be Anakin Skywalker forever. And it's him waking up on the operation table, as Vader. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's just like the first dawn of light in your universe brings pain. The light burns you. It will always burn you. Part of you will always lie upon glass Black glass sand beside a lake of fire while flames chew at your flesh. You can hear yourself breathing. It comes hard and harsh, and it scrapes nerves already raw. But you cannot stop it. You can never stop it. You can never even slow it down. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. And he's talking about it's this really chilling sense of like, this is it's hell. It is a living hell, and it's like, and that you did it also, because at the end of it, he's talking about like, he's trying to blame Palpatine and the dark side of the Force and all of it, the specter of bad decisions, all of it. And there's this ongoing metaphor of the shadow, right? And so you're talking about the shadow, and in the end, it's like this futile gesture, like trying to fight against it, and you can't. And because I'm way paraphrasing because this is a long thing, but it says, and in the end, you cannot touch the shadow. In the end, you do not even want to. In the end, the shadow is all you have left, because the shadow understands you. The shadow forgives you. The shadow gathers you unto itself, and within your furnace heart, you burn in your own flame. This is how it feels to be Anakin Skywalker. Forever. I never needed to see him again from his perspective. You know what I mean? It was so perfect that unless you were going to match that energy or somehow exceed it, which this book does at no point for me, I kind of want it to just stop there. Yeah. It's so perfect. It's so haunting. It's so resonant and powerful. And it's not that this book is terrible, Dark Lord. It's that Revenge of the Sith novel is so fucking good. It's really hard to beat.
And that's where we're all kind of coming from. Like in it of itself, like this book is it's entertaining. It has good characters, good character moments, and very, very competent writing. It's just when you set it against what came before and what it's supposed to represent for the Vader character and the wider Star Wars universe, a lot of it, at best, it just rings the same as a lot of other things you've maybe experienced from other works, and at worst, it doesn't ring at all, because so much of this story has been done before. So much of this story has been twisted in ways that are, I mean, not even arguably, more interesting, that although it is a competent piece in and of itself, you can see very much how a lot of other elements that this story had have been taken either from things that happened later in the timeline or even before in the timeline and done in a more compelling way. And when set against everything else, it just doesn't ring as strongly as it probably should have. And that's kind of, I think, where we're all coming from here, because is it something you should just skip over entirely? I don't know if I would say that, but at the same time, you can get a lot more of the elements introduced in this from other works arguably better. And I think that's what we're really kind of centering on at the end of the day.
Yeah, I wouldn't say you should skip it because it's so foul or it's bad. I would just say, if you've never read it before, just know what you're getting is, at this point, not that it's aged poorly, but the world around it. This same story has been told so many times, and it's not really doing anything super, at least in my opinion. So I think objectively, it's not doing anything unique anymore. Subjectively, I personally don't find it all that interesting or impactful. It's not that you should avoid it just because it's terrible, though. It's just it is what it is.
Because it's not terrible. It really isn't.
I'll finish on this one because this was the first time I'd read the book, obviously. So I'm kind of coming into this from that perspective of someone who reads it now, having never touched it before. Obviously, I completely agree with everything you're saying, guys. Completely. This does not stand up against some of the other greats that we're talking about at the moment. Some of the ones we've already covered, some of the ones we're covering shortly. It's certainly not Lucino at his best. Like there's a stark drop in quality from his average tier for this. Having said that, given Lucino's heights of quality as a starting point, even dropping down a little bit, he's still bringing a lot to the table that other authors just don't in the Star Wars setting. His character work in terms of the average character for the crew in this the senators when they do turn up, they're interesting. The world building touches that, though significantly less numerous than his usual story, are still present. I mean, when you talked about Kashyyyk, Evan is very good in that level, for example. He's bringing maybe 60% of what he usually brings across the board. The only part that he really drops the ball for me on this one is the fact that it's not a Vader story the way it should be, and Palpatine and Vader in particular suffer for that, both in their scene work and in the overall construction of the and framing of the plot. And on top of that, The story that is told, like these guys have said, it's nothing particularly new. It's fun, it's engaging, it's a good experience. I think it's worth having. I enjoyed myself probably more than these two did because it was the first time I'd read it. It wasn't a returning to an old kind of perceived classic that then let them down. But at the same time, I don't disagree with anything that they've said. You know, it's a story that was kind of fun. It could have been high art if they had just made these, a few of the tweaks, some of which we suggested ideas for, and others. I think just from the nature that this is not fulfilling the promise of being the rise of Darth Vader. This is a story with a lot of Vader in it, and most of the focus is on another crew that is very fun and engaging, but ultimately nothing to do with anything. It's not really consequential to the larger setting. I would recommend reading this going in with the frame of, I want just a light Star Wars story amidst some of the greats. That's how I would describe this one.
The way that you phrase that, you know how now when you pick up something that's from the Legends collection, it has a whole spiel about how, there's bits of truth in every legend, but like these things were written at a time and place that don't have anything to do with the new canon. Now, personally, I obviously don't say this to hold up the new canon as some kind of beacon of what you should focus on. But do you kind of have that same sort of vibe? Like it has an impact for you as because it's so much better than what Star Wars has become? Or do you view it in any way as still having just true value for its own sake? The way that you said that, I feel you were kind of...
I'd say a bit of both on that one. I think it certainly stands apart in quality. I mean, it's 10 times better than most of what we're seeing in the new canon. Again, that's not just that's
indisputably true.
My experience of what we've seen in the new canon, which is not all of it. It's particularly the books. I'm completely
because we like Andor. For example,
exactly. We're going to cover Andor, for example, and we've said it's in so many recordings now. But yeah, Andor is the exception to the rule for us. And it's leagues, fathoms, and better than the new material for me that I've seen. But even if that weren't true, even if it wasn't coming from that position, if we were talking about this back in 2013 before any of this stuff had come out, I think this is still a solidly good book within the Star Wars franchise, but a step beneath the greats that we've kind of really been harping on about, particularly when we're talking about the author of Lucino. So yeah, worth reading. Just put it further down the list than pretty much everything else we've been recommending lately. That's what I'll say.
Maybe someday we should do a like in the future, because we have lots of things to get to beforehand. But maybe someday we should do a ranking of Lucino's books to see how we all see them.
Yeah, well, I want to do an EU
after we get
guide, but I want to do a top 10. Hey guys, you don't know anything about the Star Wars EU? This is just digest this.
I know there's that, but there's stuff. The last stuff of his that I've never read is some of the stuff that's nudged into the middle of the NJO, and obviously he closed.
I'm really excited to get to that. I'm really excited to get to that and Unifying Force. I'll be honest, I didn't realize Unifying Force for the Lucino book. All that he has bigger presence in the NJO as he does, so I'm super excited.
Oh yeah.
So anyway,
but yeah, this has been this has been our analysis of Dark Lord: Rise of Darth Vader, end of a trilogy, finally delivered 8 years later. As Matt said, I hope it's not quite the experience of opening up a dodgy bottle of wine that you've been looking forward to, and that you get something enjoyable out of it. When we probably came across way more negative than we mean to, but it's purely in the context of Lucino is one of our favorites, and to see this not fulfill that kind of expectation, it leaves us a bit of a bad taste in the mouth. But it's still good, still recommend it, just not in the same vein as some of the others. So yeah, I'm Callan, and I still don't have an outro.
This is Matt. May the Force be with you. Thanks for watching, guys.
Evanova95, we hope you guys enjoyed. We'll see you guys later.
Goodbye.